Hello everyone, Shinto Bean here, and I have been looking forward to this day for quite some time now, ever since they first announced that they would be doing a collaboration between Warhammer 40k and Magic the Gathering. As someone who has played both Warhammer and Magic on and off over the years, I was really happy to see this. I was a little skeptical at first, it's like, would the 40k theme actually fit in the Magic card game? But after taking a look at these cards, I can say I am very impressed. And I'm particularly happy with the Tyranids. This was the deck that I'm most looking forward to. But this week we will be able to see a preview of all 4 of the 100 card commander decks. But first of all, let's take a look at these Tyranids. Starting off with the commanders themselves. The one that on the cover art for the box is the Swarm Lord, which is a very fitting commander, of course, for the Tyranid Swarm. This one costs 6 mana, so it's pretty expensive. It's a 5/5, but it comes into play with 2+1/+1 counters on it for each time you've cast it from the command zone. So it does have to be your commander for you to utilize that first ability. The second ability on there, Xenos Cunning, allows you to draw a card whenever a creature with a counter on it dies. So that is one of the main mechanics for this Tyranid deck. You have a lot of ways to put counters on your creatures, so that means with this Warlord on the field, you'll be drawing a lot of cards. Now, the other commander that you can use is Magus Lucia Kane, representing the Gene Stealer Colts, and she is not much of a fighter, being a 1/1 for 4 mana, but she plays more of a supporting role, and it is a very important supporting role indeed. First of all, you do get to put a free +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures at the beginning of combat on your turn. But the second ability, Psychic Stimulus, this is pretty huge. Tapping for 2 colorless mana itself is quite good, but if you use that to cast a spell with X in its mana cost, or use an ability, you can copy that spell or ability. So if it's a creature, you get a copy, a token of that. And yeah, that's pretty crazy, considering the number of cards that have X in the mana cost, which we will look at here. So cards that combo particularly well with this commander would first of all be the Hormigaunt Horde. This is a very nice card. You can pay any amount of mana to cast it, and depending on how much mana you spend on it, it'll be that much bigger. It'll have that many more +1/+1 counters on it when it comes into play. If it's 5 or more, you get to draw a card when it enters. So we'll see this Ravenous keyword show up on a number of cards here. The Hormigaunts are also really nice because they can come back from the dead. Once they're destroyed, when they go to the graveyard, if you play a land, you can pay 3 mana to bring it back to your hand. So they just keep coming back again and again. Really great card there. Then we got the Termagant Swarm. So these are also Ravenous, and the unique ability on these guys is Death Frenzy, which is a fun ability that when it dies, it just splits into that many Termagants. You know, separate 1/1 creatures, depending on how many counters were on it when it died. Next up, we got the Broodlord. This is more expensive, so you'll probably be wanting to play this a little bit later on in the game. This one also has Ravenous, but it also has an additional ability that lets you put more +1/+1 counters on other creatures when this comes into play. Then we got the Exocrine. This one is a little bit of a risky one to play because it's basically like a board wipe. It hits everything, all players and all creatures, for X damage depending on how much you spend when casting it. So it was a bit of an odd one. I mean, obviously you don't want to play it if you have like a bunch of 1/1 creatures in play. But yeah, it can be very powerful, very useful to clear the enemy board. We've got the Ravener. So this thing has flash, so you can play it in your opponent's turn, and when it comes into play, you can force an enemy, basically goad an enemy creature to attack another opponent. So it's best, obviously, in multiplayer games when you're playing with 3 or more people. There are a few cards in here that are thematically a little bit weird, having X in the cost, like the Hormigant and Termagant Swarms I can understand, but then things like the Mawloc, which is supposed to be like a gigantic creature. It's kind of weird with this Ravenous ability where, you know, you can either make it like a 2/2 or a 10/10 depending on how much mana you spend on it. But the second ability on this one, Terror from the Deep, allows it to fight up to one enemy creature, and if it dies, it gets exiled, just removed from the game. So pretty useful for taking out an important enemy card. Then we got the Turvagon. I'm very happy to see this one in the game. It's got Trample. This one also kind of weird how it's the size of it depends on how much mana you spend to cast it. But the Spawn Termagant's ability is really fun. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you create that many 1/1 green Tyranid creatures. So the bigger it is, the more Termagants you can potentially spawn when it attacks. We got the Sporicist, which has Defender, so it cannot attack. But this one allows you to search your library for X basic lands and put them into play. So it helps you with that mana ramp. It is a little bit expensive though. You have to pay, basically if you pay 2 extra mana, you'll get 1 land. Alright, then we got the Aberrant, one of the Gene Stealer Cults units. It's got Trample, and it's got a really big hammer. So when it deals combat damage to a player, it can smash an artifact or enchantment. Useful ability there. Then we got the Tyrant Guard. I'm not really sure why this thing is Ravenous, but the second ability is extremely useful. If you have a lot of creatures with those +1/+1 counters on them on the field, you can sacrifice your Tyrant Guard to protect them for that turn. They gain hexproof, so they can't be targeted by enemy spells or abilities, and indestructible for that turn. So very, very strong ability there. Then we got the Zoanthrope. I think this is the last of the cards with the X in the casting cost. This one has Flying and Ward. Ward makes it a little bit harder to target by enemy spells or abilities. And then Warp Blast, it deals X damage to any target just one time when it enters the battlefield. Alright, then we got an enchantment here, the first Tyrannic Ward. This is a pretty expensive enchantment at 5 mana and requiring 3 different colors to cast. But it combos really well with those cards with X in the mana cost because it allows you to play one for free, and the X is equal to the number of lands you have in play at the time. So it's better off, obviously, if you have a lot of lands, that you'll be able to get more out of it. And then it's a saga, so it takes place over 3 turns. In turns 2 or 3, after it's deployed on the field, it doubles the number of counters on a single creature you control. So, if you have something with 5 +1/+1 counters, it becomes 10. If you got 10, it becomes 20. Things can get really big. Here we've got the Nexos, which is a very useful card, which gives all of your basic lands an additional ability to tap for 2 colorless mana, which can only be spent to play those cards with X in the mana cost. But yeah, as you can imagine, this can be extremely useful, allowing you to play some really big cards. We've got a bunch of other cards that combo with +1/+1 counters, either gaining +1/+1 counters or giving them to other creatures. This one was a little bit of a weird one for me. I really like the artwork on the Haruspex, but it's only a 2/2. It does get bigger anytime anything dies. I like that part, but the second ability, Devouring Monster, where it taps to remove counters from itself, making it smaller again, to add mana of any color, it can be a useful ability. It's just kind of weird having it on this, what's supposed to be like a combat unit. But there you go. We got the Biophagus. This one is quite good as a support unit. Only 2 mana, and it can tap to add 1 of any color. If you spend that on a creature, it gets an additional +1/+1 counter. So very useful in the early game. We got the Pure Strain Gene Stealer, which comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters. When it attacks, you can remove 1 to get a basic land. Again, useful early game for that mana ramp. We've got the Trigon Prime. It's a 4/4 for 4 mana. Subterranean Assault allows it to put a +1/+1 counter on itself and 1 other attacking creature, which cannot be blocked this turn. Which making it unblockable, that's quite useful, and it combos with a lot of other cards in the deck. We've got the Goliath Truck, which is an artifact. It can only attack when crewed by another creature. You have to tap another creature, but this one can also add +1/+1 counters to another attacking creature. We've got the Malanthrope. This is a Forge World model, I believe. And it's for 3 mana, it's a 2/2 with flying. And this one made me laugh because it's like very specifically an anti-Necron card, because the Necron Commander Deck revolves around putting things in the graveyard. So when this comes into play, say goodbye to the enemy graveyard and you get that many +1/+1 counters. Potentially very good later on in the game. We got the Red Terror. I was really happy to see this one. Classic, legendary character, and the ability is a pretty fun one too. It activates whenever a red source you control deals damage to something, and it actually combos really well with a lot of the red cards in this deck because most of them are able to deal damage outside of combat, so you could potentially see it activating multiple times per turn. We've got the Clamavus, which this thing has an insanely strong ability, giving each creature you control +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on it. Like, I would expect this ability to be on a much more impressive character, but I guess this guy is the man of the moment with those loudspeakers there. And we've got an equipment here, Bone Sabers, which can be quite good, giving 4 +1/+1 counters. It is a bit expensive though to equip, so a little bit slow. We've got the Winged Hive Tyrant. This is a 4/4 with flying and haste, so it can attack the turn it's played for 5 mana. And this one also combos with the counters. So other creatures you control with counters on them have flying and haste. Now, one of the things that I was a little bit worried about with this Tyranid deck was that they might be too similar to Slivers, because I actually have a Sliver Commander deck. And so this is one of a few cards that functions kind of similar to Slivers, where it gives your other creatures additional abilities. But yeah, it does only combo with ones that have counters on them. And the whole counter thing is a pretty big central theme to these Tyranid cards. Another legendary creature here, we got the Death Leaper. This one actually combos quite well with the Hive Tyrant. So creatures you control that entered the battlefield this turn have double strike. It's situational because it only affects cards with flash or haste. Flash allows you to play the card in the opponent's turn, so those cards will get double strike, and could then block. And then creatures with haste, of course, you play on your turn, they can attack that turn and they have double strike, but they lose double strike at the end of the turn. We've got the Lictor here, which has flash as well, so this combos with the Death Leaper. If you play on your opponent's turn and they also played a creature, then you get an additional 3/3 Tyranid Warrior with Trample into play. And then another card with haste, actually the only other card I think in this deck with haste, is the Atalin Jackal, and that one's good just for getting you some extra land, best played early in the game. Now we're getting to the fun stuff here. This is the biggest creature in the deck, the Hierophant Bio-Titan. 12 mana, so very expensive mana cost, but you can reduce that mana cost by 2 for each +1/+1 counter you remove from among your creatures. It's got Vigilance, so it doesn't tap to attack. It's got Reach, so it can block flying, and then Ward makes it harder to target by enemies. It also cannot be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, so as a 12/12, this thing is pretty insane. The Genestealer Patriarch has a nice combo of abilities. The Genestealer's Kiss allows it to put an infection counter on any creature the defending player controls. And when the creature with an infection counter dies, you actually get a copy of it into play, but it also counts as a Tyranid. So fun little card there, allowing you to infest an enemy and then basically take control of it when it dies. Old One Eye, another legendary character I was really happy to see in this game. This is a pretty insane card. 6 mana for a 6/6 with Trample. It gives all of your other creatures Trample, and then it also spawns a 5/5 green Tyranid creature into play. I wasn't sure where that idea came from. Like, I seem to remember, maybe does Old One Eye have his own brood of Carnifexes or something? I'm not sure, because obviously, I mean, he doesn't spawn creatures himself, but yeah, very powerful ability. And then the final ability down there, Fast Healing, allows you to bring it back from the graveyard although you do have to discard 2 cards from your hand, which is pretty steep price. Obviously, if you want cards in your graveyard, that can be very useful, but still a very powerful card right there. We've got the Screamer Killer, which is a 5/5 with trample, which also deals 5 damage whenever you cast another big creature that costs 5 or more. And then the Tyranid Prime, this also combos with bigger creatures, but this one can be a little bit of a headache, I think, when you play it. Evolve is like, it gives all of your creatures evolve, so just keeping track of like which creatures get the counters could be difficult if you have a lot of stuff on the field. We got the Toxicrene, 4 mana for 2/4 with Reach and Death Touch, so it destroys anything it damages. Quite good. The second ability is kind of weird. Not one I would expect for a Toxicrene, but Hypertoxic Miasma. It makes all lands produce 1 mana of any color. So that's both your lands and opponent's lands, which is kind of nuts. But they also lose all of their abilities. So but depending on what your opponent is playing, this could actually help them. But if they have a lot of non-basic lands with really good abilities, this could shut those down as well. The Tyranid Harridan, 6 mana for a 4/4 with flying and ward 4. So yeah, very difficult to target this thing with enemy spells. And this is a fun ability. It's pretty similar. It reminds me of the Brood Sliver. So whenever any Tyranid you control deals combat damage to a player, you get a 1/1 flying Gargoyle creature into play. I really like those abilities that can like generate lots of tokens and swarms. So very cool card. If you're wondering what gargoyles are, that's what they look like. This is a Gargoyle Flock, 2/2 with flying, and this one is quite nice because it just generates 1 gargoyle at the end of each of your turns, as long as you played a creature that turn. And then we've got the Kellermorph. This is a legendary dude with a pretty insane ability. He actually combos pretty well with those cards that can generate tokens, especially the gargoyles with flying. But whenever another source you control deals exactly 1 damage to any permanent or player, this guy deals an additional 2 damage to that target. So you could really deal a ton of damage with this, and this card would actually combo very well with a lot of other decks, I think, outside of this Tyranid deck. So very strong card right there. And then we've got the Tyranid Invasion. It's just a sorcery for 4 mana, which can create a 3/3 Tyranid Warrior with trample, equal to the number of opponents you have, so better off if you're playing with lots of people. We got the Gene Stealer Locus. This has a pretty useful ability for 4 mana. It weakens all creatures that are attacking you and toughens up the creatures that are attacking your opponents. We got the Venom Thrope, which is 3 mana for 2/2 with flying, Death Touch, and Hexproof. I'm not sure why this thing has flying. Like, can it actually fly? It doesn't look like something that can fly. I don't know. If anyone who plays Tyranids has input on this, I really want to know why they gave this thing flying. And then we got the Acolyte Hybrid, which can destroy artifacts, but if it destroys that artifact, the owner gets to draw a card. Finally, we've got the Shadow in the Warp, which is a useful enchantment that makes your first creature 2 less mana to cast every turn, but when your opponent casts a non-creature spell, it deals 2 damage to them. That happens once each turn. Alright, so those were all of the cards that are actually brand new to the world of Magic, and they also have a bunch of cards that they reprinted and just gave Tyranid-themed artwork. So this is the first of those. Hardened Scales actually combos really well with the Tyranid mechanics here of +1/+1 counters. Love the artwork on that. We've got Bread for the Hunt, which also combos with the counters, allowing you to draw more cards. Death's Presence allows you to redistribute the counters when a creature dies. We got Inspiring Call, which is an instant that lets you draw cards. The more creatures you have with counters on them, the more cards you'll draw, and also those creatures are indestructible for that turn. Potentially pretty strong. And then we've got some cards for mana ramp and that also combo with the counters like New Horizons. We've got cards that benefit tribal decks, which obviously are good with the Tyranids, like Herald's Horn and Icon of Ancestry. And we've got Hull Breach, just a useful sorcery. And then Abundance is good for getting the card you want that turn. Whenever you draw a card, you can either choose land or non-land, and you are guaranteed to get the card of that type. Star Storm, good for clearing the board. Aetherize, very useful instant to stop your opponent's attacking. Sol Ring, a necessity for any commander deck. Arcane Signet, also useful. And then we have a bunch of mana ramp cards here, like Harrow. We got Rampant Growth, Cultivate, Explore, Farseek, and Overgrowth. And then we get into the non-basic lands, so Command Tower, of course, and Exotic Orchard, very good for producing multiple colors of mana. We've got Opal Palace and Cave of Temptation, which also have a ability that involves +1/+1 counters. Path of Ancestry and Unclaimed Territory, which are good when you're playing Tyranid creatures. And then we got a bunch of dual lands here, as well as one land that taps for all 3, green, blue, or red. And that is it. That is all of the cards other than the basic lands in this deck. So let me know what you think if you are a Warhammer fan. Let me know if you think that they did a good job representing the creatures of the Tyranid Swarm in this deck. And if you are someone who plays Magic, let me know what you think are the strongest cards and the best combos, and if you think this deck is worth buying. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.